Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This will be week 3 in chapter 3, mapping an argument. Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to talk about how we observe the structure of an argument. And so diagramming the argument is important to understanding how the argument works, namely how the premises work to support the conclusion. So I'll call for you guys to put the argument into the argument form that we learned last chapter, premise, conclusion. And to number the premises to conclusion in ascending order. So the first premise will be number 1, and the conclusion will be whatever the last number in your set of propositions is. So this means that at least for this, the conclusion will always be the highest number. I think it makes things easier to see. So that's why I want you to first, when you see an argument in narrative form, put it in argument form, and then number, going down there. So let's start off pretty easy. So I have an example here, right? So the example is, so here's narrative form. You can put NF. Because all frogs are green, it follows that Kermit the frog is green. Okay? Very simple in the trees. Okay. So pretty simple argument there, right? One premise, one conclusion. So let's go ahead and put an argument form. Put AF. So premise 1, all frogs are green. Conclusion. Okay, the Kermit the Frog is green, right? So how does this argument work now? That's what we're going to be looking at this chapter. So this one's obviously very simple. Clearly there's one premise that supports a conclusion in a linear way. So we can number this proposition, right, as a whole, number 1, and number the conclusion, number 2, right? And so clearly 1 supports number 2. Alright, so that's the kind of thing that we're going to be doing. So the diagram shows that the premise, which is proposition number 1, supports proposition number 2, which is the conclusion. So this may not seem very important, this may seem even trivial at this point, but as the arguments get more complex, it's going to be really helpful to see how the premises work together to get to this final conclusion, maybe the end of the map if you want to think of it that way. Actually, that may be a good analogy. Think of, I do call this mapping an argument or diagramming an argument. And so we can actually call this the diagram form. But so, like I said, I do think of these as maps. So it's the roadmap of the argument, right? When you go on a trip, you have your milestones that you may see, right? If you're going to Canada from, let's say, Northeast Ohio, you're going to have to go through Pennsylvania. You're going to have to you're going to stop at Angola rest stop. You're going to go through Buffalo. You reach the border, and then maybe you'll go to whatever Canadian city you're going to, right? There's steps along the way. And, right, you have to merge onto 90. You have to merge onto another freeway. That's kind of how these maps work, right? What steps are we taking to get to the end goal? And so most of them will have more than one premise and conclusion. Actually, I think all of them will. You won't see one like this anywhere because that's a very simple argument. And quite frankly, I could have actually put in another premise. But so we're going to look at 3 main types of arguments, okay? There's going to be a serial argument. And so a serial argument is a pretty simple structure. It's linear, if you want to call it that. It just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, So let's say we have 4 premises. This, actually, before we get to that, this is a serial argument, right? A straight line. So let's go ahead and look at another one, right? So the example narrative form, I'm not going to write out all the narrative forms. If you look at the notes, it's in here. So you can look at it, but I will diagram them on the board here so you can see kind of how it's done. In narrative form, the argument is, because I drank a pint of coffee, I am super hyper, therefore I cannot sit still, right? So this is an extended argument, right? We have two conclusions here. First, we have our premises. So let's put this in argument form. As you see, I've done that. So premise 1 is, I drank coffee. Conclusion 1 / premise 2 is, therefore I am super hyper. Seems to make sense, right? If you drink coffee, you get kind of hyper. Conclusion 2, I cannot sit still. When you're hyper, you can't sit still. Okay? How do these work together? So clearly, we've numbered them. Let's actually write this in argument form. So we have the narrative form. Let's put it in argument form. So premise 1 is, I drank a lot of coffee. So conclusion 1 / premise 2, therefore, if you guys have taken math, you know the 3 dots means therefore. Therefore, I am super hyper. Conclusion 2, therefore, I can't sit still, right? So let's go ahead and number these propositions, right? So this will be given number 1. This will be given number 2. And this will be given number 3. Okay? So how do these arguments work together, right? Let's map it. So if we look at the arguments, we see that 1 supports 2. And we see that 2 then supports 3, right? So I drank coffee, which means that I'm super hyper, and because I'm hyper, I can't sit still. So, again, serial argument forms are just going to be one line. That's why I also call them linear, right? And you can think of them as like a chain of events, right? So the fact that I drink coffee led to the fact that I'm super hyper, and the fact that I'm super hyper led to the fact that I can't sit still. So we would take proposition 1, which supports proposition 2, which supports proposition 3. Okay? And when you do these for the homework and stuff, you will actually have to write these. You see in the notes I wrote a little side note of what to use. You can use dashes or the single line that's found under the backspace key. You don't have to use arrows or anything super fancy. As long as I can see that there's some type of line being drawn there. If you want to, you could do that in Microsoft Word and then copy and paste it into the answer portions of the homework. That may be the easiest. But moving on. So this is what we call serial argument form. All right? So it's just a straight line. I won't ask you to identify. I won't, you won't necessarily need to know this term, and, I won't put on a quiz or on the homework. I won't give you a map and say, hey, what type of argument is this? I don't think that's really useful. But it is good to know kind of what it is and generally how it works. Okay, so the second type of argument, we'll go ahead and erase this. I'll give you an extra second if you want. So the second type is a convergent. These happen a lot. Essentially what a convergent argument form is think about it, 2 things are converging, right? So there's 2 premises that support one conclusion independently, right? I use the argument here. So Raskolnikov will confess his crime because of his guilty conscience. Also, he thinks he will get a lighter sentence if he confesses. So let's put that into argument form, right? I'm just going to write down R for Raskolnikov. For any literary buffs out there, that's the character from Crime and Punishment, one of my favorite books. So let's reread the narrative form. So Raskolnikov will confess his crime because of his guilty conscience, right? So right there we can see that the fact that he has a guilty conscience will make him confess his crime. So the guilty conscience is the first premise, and the fact that he'll confess is a conclusion, right? And so then we see here, it says also he thinks he'll get a lighter sentence if he confesses. So this is again supporting the conclusion that he will confess, right? So let's write it in argument form. So AF, premise 1, R has a guilty conscience. What we said the other premise was that R he'll get a lighter sentence if he confesses. Conclusion, therefore, R will confess, right? Okay, so that's how the argument is played out with premises and conclusions. So we see here 1, premise 2 will be proposition 2, and the conclusion will be proposition 3. So how does this argument work, right? Notice, we can get to that conclusion with just one of these premises. We don't necessarily need both, right? If I said, hey, let's say Roger, Raskolnikov's a hard name. Let's say Roger thinks he'll get an easier sentence if he confesses, therefore he will confess. That seems to make sense as an argument on its own, right? And also, if you say Roger has a guilty conscience, therefore he'll confess, that seems to make sense too. But if you put both those premises, then it kind of strengthens the argument altogether. Like, hey, we have these 2 reasons why he's going to confess, right? And so because they work independently of one another, you have 1 right here, you have 2 over here, and they converge, they come together to support 3 independently, right? So when you're looking at an argument and you're trying to see, how are these premises working, think of if you can come up with the conclusion or whatever, these 2 propositions are supporting. If you come up with that conclusion that they're supporting independently, right, with just one of those, right? Can we come up with 3 with just 1, or can we come up with 3 with just 2? If that's the case, then they're converging lines, all right? So that is a convergent argument. You'll see these a lot. They are quite common. The next is a linked argument. Go ahead and erase this. Okay, so in linked arguments, premises work together to support a conclusion, but they support it together. So what is that? How does this differ from a convergent argument, right? In a convergent argument, remember, 2 or more premises work together to support a conclusion independently. Whereas in a linked argument, 2 or more premises work together to support a conclusion, but they need each other to get that conclusion, right? So if you just had one of those premises, you wouldn't have a necessary connection to that conclusion, right? Let's say I said, if I wash the dishes, then my mother will be happy, right? And I want to prove that my mother will be happy. So let's say I have that. We'll go to the arguments on the page, but let's say, okay, P1, if I wash dishes, then mother will be happy. P2, I wash dishes, therefore mother is happy, right? So this is a linked argument. Look at our premises. If I wash the dishes, then my mother will be happy. Premise 2, I wash the dishes. Conclusion, my mother is happy, right? And we could go ahead and number these. 1, 2, 3. So, how does this work? Clearly, 1 and 2 work together to support 3, right? Now let's just say I gave you just premise 1 and the conclusion. So I just said, if I wash the dishes, my mother will be happy, therefore my mother will be happy. Well, something's missing there, right? You can't necessarily get that connection unless you know whether or not I actually washed the dishes, right? And now let's say I just gave you premise 2 and I just said, I wash the dishes, therefore my mother's happy. Well, why does that make my mother happy? Without the condition that you set in the first premise, you don't really understand why that argument works. So you get a relationship such that 1 is linked together with 2, right? So this line shows that these two premises are working together and they're dependent on one another, right? So unlike the convergent arguments where the premises were independent of one another to support the conclusion, in a linked argument, both premises are dependent on one another to support a conclusion, meaning they can't stand alone to support the conclusion. So in that situation, 1 and 2 work together to support 3, right? So that line, remember, this line underneath shows that they're linked, okay? And again, when you're doing this, when you're typing this in your computer, if you use the underline key in like Microsoft Word to underline them, that's good. You know, that works to show that. So what we're really going to look at, though, it's not going to be often. In the real world, arguments aren't this simple. Some are. Some arguments are this simple. I mean, this is an argument that I would use almost every day, right? Because I like to make my mother happy. But most arguments aren't this simple. Most arguments are mixed arguments. And what do I mean by mixed argument? By mixed argument, I mean all 3 of those forms are mixed together in some way, or maybe just 2, right? 2 or more of those forms are both used for one argument. And that happens often, right? Two premises will work in one way to support one premise that directly supports something else. So these cookie cutter examples aren't very common. So let's go ahead and do an example of one. I have a pretty good one here. 6 proposition narrative. So let's go ahead and erase this real quick. Alright, so we'll read the narrative form. I don't really want to write the whole narrative form up, but I will write the argument form, and then we'll do the diagram or the map, however you want to call that. Okay, so narrative form. If Wesley saves Buttercup, then he loves her. Wesley saved Buttercup, therefore Wesley loves Buttercup. Also, if Wesley risks his life for Buttercup, then he loves Buttercup. Wesley risked his life for Buttercup. Because Wesley loves Buttercup, it necessarily follows that he cares for her, right? If these characters sound familiar, it's because it's from one of my favorite movies, The Princess Bride. If you haven't seen it, go see it, but do your homework first. We have a lot of things going on here. So let's just, before we even put it into argument form, let's talk through it. What's going on in this argument here? So it seems like we have 2 arguments that come together that support one thing, right? So, and that one thing is that Wesley loves Buttercup. So what's the one argument? On the one side, we have the argument that if Wesley saves Buttercup, then he loves her, and he did indeed save her, so he loves her, right? So that's one side. If Wesley loves Buttercup, then he loves her, he saved her, therefore he loves her. On this side, we have if Wesley risks his life for Buttercup, then he loves Buttercup. He did risk his life, therefore he loves her, right? So these two arguments seem to be working. It seems like either of these arguments could support the claim that Wesley loves Buttercup, right? But those arguments have different structures. So we've got at least that. And then we see that it says, because Wesley loves Buttercup, it necessarily follows that he cares about her. So there's a direct link. Because he loves her, he cares about her, right? So let's go ahead and write the premises on the board in argument form, right? And we'll talk a number of the propositions, and we'll talk a little bit more about how this argument works, all right? So I'm going to pick up. So I'll never remember all this. Let's see. Argument form. Can you see that? Yes, you can. On this one, if W is B, then W loves B. W saves B. Let's put if W risks his life for B, then he loves B. W risks his life for B. So conclusion one, the first conclusion that we can draw, which will also be used as the fifth premise, is that W loves B. And the second conclusion that we come to, the ultimate conclusion, is W cares about B, right? And obviously W stands for Wesley, B stands for Buttercup. I didn't necessarily want to write Buttercup 6 times. So let's go ahead and number these. All right, let's do it here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? So that first conclusion, let's see what helps support that. So clearly, if Wesley saves Buttercup, then he loves her. And because he did in fact save her, it follows that he loves her. So that's one argument. And how does this argument work, right? It's evident, right, that these two premises have to work together. If I just said, hey, Wesley saved Buttercup, therefore he loves her. Well, you didn't add a stipulation that says that, right? And if I just said, well, if it was the case that he saved her, then he would love her, so he totally loves her. That doesn't necessarily make the case because you don't have any factual evidence to support it. So we at least have 1 working with 2 to support 5, right? Well, if we look at propositions 3 and 4, we see that they have a similar relationship, right? If Wesley risks his life for Buttercup, then he loves Buttercup. And he did indeed risk his life for Buttercup, therefore he loves her. Alright, works the same way as 1 and 2 supporting 5 did. And again, they need to work together for that to happen, right? So 3 and 4 also support 5. Now, here's an interesting point. Let me make sure that looks like a 4. Okay. Why is it the case that 1, 2, 3, and 4 are not all linked together? Well, the reason why that is because these two work independently of these two to support this. Okay? They work, 1 and 2 work together to support 5, and 3 and 4 work together to support 5, but 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 don't work together. They work independently, and they converge upon 5. Alright? Hope that's clear to you. And I hope everybody sees why that's the case. Right? And so what do we have left? We have number 6 left, and so it said, because Wesley loves Buttercup, Wesley cares about Buttercup. And so there's clearly a direct relation between 5 and 6. So that's the serial part of the argument, right? So in this argument, we have all three types of argument, right? So here, we have a linked argument. All right? That's the linked argument part. Now, I'm going to use a box. Right? That whole area, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, convergent argument. I'll use a triangle here for this. 5 and 6 are a serial argument, or form a serial argument, rather. Okay? This stuff's a little confusing. I know it's a little counterintuitive, I guess, in a certain way. It may not make sense, but remember, so what are some tips in helping you do this. Like I said, when you get the argument in narrative form, if that's how you get it, put it into argument form first, right? And take a peek at how all of the premises are being worked together, right? I know the homework is going to have 1 or 2 really difficult problems. If I see that everybody gets a certain problem wrong, I'll go ahead and waive it. Unless all of you decide not to do it, then I will. You guys will all get zeros. But this homework does have 1 or 2 really difficult problems with really extended and mixed arguments. Try your best. Don't get disheartened. Again, always email me if you want to meet up and work through some arguments. Email me. We can set up a time to do that possibly. But otherwise, go ahead and try your best with this stuff and let me know. You'll also, so your first quiz, I believe, is going to be presented at the end of the week, and it will cover a couple of different things. It'll cover, identifying what type of argument is present. It'll cover putting things into argument form, and it'll cover putting things into diagram form. It'll only be about 10 questions, but 3 parts per question, and those are the 3 parts. So make sure that you're good on that stuff. I know some people said they had some problems with the inductive and deductive stuff. Like I said, I don't know exactly how I can make it more clear. Deductive arguments try to say that something is going to happen with certainty, whereas inductive arguments don't, I guess, possess absolute certainty in their conclusion. So really, if you're trying to decide between inductive and deductive, look at the conclusion and see what level of certainty it's trying to claim. That'll probably be your best bet in identifying those. If you're having problems with argument form, let me know definitely, because it's going to be a huge factor. You're going to have to identify between premises and conclusions probably for the rest of the course. So it's going to be a big factor. And if you are having problems with that, again, always look at that key of premise indicators and conclusion indicators. I think that'll be a big help for you as well with some of this mapping stuff. Try your best and let me know. I will let you know that after this chapter, after this week, and after the quiz, you'll maybe only see mapping with a few questions on the midterm. So you do need to know it going forward here. I don't want you to forget it, but I think if I remember correctly, the midterm doesn't have super difficult mapping questions because it's something that isn't used a lot in logic, but at least it's not used directly in logic, but knowing how arguments work is huge. It's absolutely huge. The diagram itself, very few people actually make the diagrams, but the diagrams help to illustrate how arguments work, how an individual uses a certain premise to support a certain conclusion, and that's very big. Because if you ever want to disprove an argument, you want to see where there's a weak point in it, and this is kind of how you figure that out. So this is an important skill to have, and so do your best with it, and go ahead and have a great week.